Came all the way to Worlds to talk about an issue which is on the front page of every single Pakistani newspaper, literally every other day. And while the Belt and Road Initiative is something that's a subject of analysis, we've seen the individual impacts of it. So the BRI funded the Orange Line in Lahore, which is an overpriced overground transport network which turned our home city into a dirty, dusty construction site. We had our historical monuments ruined, our trees being shot down to make way for a project that has nothing to do with development and everything to do with politics, power, and patronage. And that's not just true for Pakistan. It's true for countries like Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, and multiple other countries part of the 68 which formed this initiative. We think that this initiative is simply a geopolitical ploy for China to entrap large sections of the developing world into dependency and debt. And that's how we think it wants to win over the world. So what really is this initiative, right? We think this is an economic initiative which is spearheaded by China involving about 68 countries, which is meant to create trading routes between 3 different continents and across all of these cities. So basically, the investment for this project will come from Chinese loans, which are at Chinese set interest rates. Even more than that, Chinese corporations will carry out this investment in things like energy and things like transport. So we think this is basically what this project looks like. But let's talk to you about our 4 lines of argument. 1, how the BRI doesn't benefit the participants within it. Number 2, how BRI financing is predatory and creates havoc in the local economies. 3, how it paves the way for Chinese hegemony. And 4, which is our second speaker case, about how it's harmful to China itself. So let's talk to you about the first line of argument first. And here we need to identify the nature of this initiative, or basically why it even came into place. We think that firstly, it was basically for the benefit of China. Why so? Because we think that while China has access to the South China Sea, a large part of the country is absolutely landlocked. So in order to make up for that or overcome that difficulty, China then decided to have connectivity through other countries, right? So for instance, it makes use of the Gwadar port, which is in Pakistan, in order to have access to the Gulf states. So what in the past took 4,000 miles for China to get there will now be much, much quicker, much easier, and much easier, right? So and much less expensive. So we think that's where China's interest lies. So, which is why we think it's for the benefit of that country. But even more than that, we think Chinese corporations have this requirement within this initiative that you have to employ Chinese labor and have Chinese corporations within it, which means that the benefit to the community was never really a goal of this project to begin with. But even more than that, right? We think that another aspect of this project is the political bribes to local leaders. What do we mean by this? We think many of the projects that are a part of this initiative are absolutely unnecessary. So for instance, within Sri Lanka, we had the previous President Mahinda, who had Chinese sponsor the Matlala International Airport, which is now dubbed as the world's emptiest airport. Why was this built then? This was built simply because China bribes local leaders, because local leaders want support and funding, and it gives that to them. In response, they give China its support over their country, giving up their own sovereignty. That's why we think this project is inherently dangerous. But thirdly, environmental damage. Why do we think environmental damage happens in this case? It happens in this case because China isn't really concerned with this. Now let me explain this to you in the context of China as running the global green power sit-down, sir. We think that while China itself is moving towards green energy, it has large amounts of companies that still produce things like coal. So it's sending these corporations into other countries and carrying out those projects. So for instance, in Afghanistan, it created a nuclear power plant because it couldn't do so within its own borders. Which is why we think for these multiple reasons, China did not have this initiative to benefit local populations. And if there is a benefit, it's very, very marginal. It's meant to benefit itself. But our second line of argument, about how it entraps these countries into cycles of debt. We think that the biggest problem here is that when it gives loans to these countries, it firstly specifically targets countries that are vulnerable, but secondly, it never really carries out a proper economic evaluation. So for instance, in Laos, one of the railways that was being built was for $7 billion. The entire GDP of Laos is $12 billion. That is absolutely insane, because without even carrying out economic evaluations, it gives these loans, at the same time increasing interest rates. So So interest rates went from 2% to 5%. So not only this, right, what does this lead to? This leads to situations where these countries are unable to pay back this debt. What happens when they're unable to pay back this debt? We think that what China then does is turns this debt into equity. So for instance, in the example of Sri Lanka, right, when Sri Lanka couldn't pay back Chinese debt, it leased out its ports for a number of years. So not only are they out there for your money, they're out there for your land, right? So even if this infrastructure is built, China has control over it and China benefits off of it. So we think that if there's any benefit, it's absolutely marginal or absolutely non-existent, right? So we think that the very purpose that they're there for is firstly to make sure that once you're trapped in debt, because for instance in Sri Lanka, their previous government was replaced by another one who is now spending 85% of their GDP trying to pay back Chinese debt. So they're stuck with China, right? They're stuck there and their lands are being taken over, and we think that this is exactly what happened in the past. This is simply in Chinese imperialism, and it's something that's absolutely abhorrent and something we need to protect our countries from rather than subject them to it, right? But the third line of argument, the harms of Chinese hegemony. Here we need to understand that China, because of the fact that these countries are stuck in like multiple year contracts with China, so they can't get out of it even if there's harms. Secondly, because they're stuck in like a cycle of debt. And thirdly, they're dependent on China for funding their infrastructure. The problem is that these countries are now subservient to China. It has leverage over them. So for instance, in Djibouti, one of the informal conditions for this infrastructure or for the loans was that China would be allowed to build a military base there. In just a second, sir. So this means that China is now using its economic control to carry out its political motives. I'll prove to you the harms of that in just a second. Go ahead.
What is your alternative for these countries receiving investment and development?
Sit down, sir. We don't think it's our burden to prove to you an alternative. However, what is our burden to prove to you is that these countries will be in a much worse state than they are in status quo. We think if we do that, we're doing just fine within this debate. So let's go on with our own line of argument, right? So we think that the number of countries involved and the scale of the project means that China will be a guaranteed hegemon as a result of this. Why is this bad? We think there's three reasons. Firstly, because we don't think China really upholds international law. What do we mean by this argument? We think historically China hasn't really cared about what the international community talks about or what they value, right? So for instance, even within the South China Sea conflict, they're violating international law. When they were funding North Korea, violating international law. This means that they don't really espouse the same values as the rest of us do, right? Even more than that, they're not even a democratic state, which means that that's even worse when it comes to the countries within OBOR. Because understand this, the countries a part of this initiative have weak democracies or sham democracies. There are in a lot of states authoritarian regimes. That's problematic in the context of those countries because they need some sort of stability. But when China is funding their regimes, there's absolutely no stability. How does that happen, right? Second idea here. We think that China strives off of non-democratic systems, such as Venezuela, such as Kyrgyzstan. Why is this? Because it's simply easier to deal with such regimes, right? Because they don't need the support of their people in order to get Chinese backing. All China needs to do in that case is sway their local leader or their politician, and as a result, get all that it wants. We think as a result of this, countries like North Korea or a lot of North African states are a part of this initiative, which makes it very dangerous. Because what it does is that it empowers these regimes to continue oppressing their own people, and then empowered to create a global threat. So because we think these countries are vulnerable and they need help, not Chinese influence, we think that this is an initiative we could never support. For all those reasons, vote Pakistan.
The team propositions came with the idea that they have to give you no alternative. Because that is the same rhetoric that the West has for years put on these countries where they are isolated and neglected from the institutions. For them to tell you that these countries will have no alternative is for these countries to be forgotten. What will they do throughout the speech? First of all, upon the refutations of their doing arguments. Second of all, upon their own case that have boosted growth. And on our second argument, in which we will talk about global balance. Before anything, let us just highlight the biggest problem with Pakistan, in which we tell you, even in their best case scenario where they can prove their own country, we tell you we'll just prove to you the other 42. Because it is in the moment in which they are just capable of pushing that example that will tell you they're losing strategically. We do agree with the burdens and the framework for this debate. And on the first argument, well, they talk about the idea of how you are connecting people through the Pakistan port and allowing for China to have access to South China Sea. They also talk about the requirement to employ Chinese labor. Notice that the problem with Cyprus' position is that they are doing no comparative as for this debate. The question in this round is not what is it that the Belt and Road does to these countries, but rather what's the other alternative that these countries have. Because the alternative that they have is either they are forgotten or they trade with China on its own, which have no checks and balances, then it's a massive problem. When they talk about, for example, Chinese labor and how you're not giving any benefit, A, we tell you that in Africa, 20% of the jobs are given to African people, but B, that even in our worst case scenario, you have no jobs in the first place, right? What you do at least is, well, you give Chinese labor that wouldn't have given to for African people in the first place. But when they talk about, for example, the environmental damage, we answer you two things. First of all, it is exactly because of the Belt and Road Initiative that 4 years ago there was a summit with the United Nations on environmental issues. That was the moment in which China started being involved on these environmental issues and can now be engaged on this part. But second, how China is investing on the ASEAN and on all of the investment and all of the environmental plan because of the Belt and Road. What we do is that we engage them on internationality, and now they are buying that to responding to these types of stuff. But on the second point, where they talk about the idea of debts and how you're putting the countries like, for example, Sri Lanka in very bad positions. Judges, the Sri Lanka point wouldn't have existed in the first place without China. Now Sri Lanka has 30% of the gains. No, thank you. 30% of the gains of that port. And I'll tell you, what's better? To have 100% gains on something that doesn't work, or 30% of something that is actively giving profits to your nation. But when they talk about debts, we tell you something very simple. Did you know that China has eliminated, no thank you, the debt from 33 countries, including Angola and Djibouti, that were in massive economic problems? It is because of the Belt and Road Initiative that in many countries, China and the Belt and Road Initiative would even drop the debts that these countries have. Why is this so? Because they have a profit incentive, and because they need for these countries to be economically sustainable, so that the demand continues to exist. It is when these countries have a sustainable economy that the Belt and Road Initiative is effective. That is where we mean. No, thank you. Lastly, when they talk about the weak democracies and how you're just helping oppressive regimes, we tell you, judges, on our side what we do is that we help the people that are already oppressed. We don't think that people should be affected and should not have any possibilities of developing because of the government that they have. Yes.
Where do you think is better, having no port and no debt, or having one port you can't use and $8 billion of debt?
We tell you that in many cases China has pardoned the debt. And we think in our status quo, what now Sri Lanka has is 30% at a constant rate of gain. We think that is way better, even if you were to have the debt that you would have had with Sri Lanka trading with only China and not the Belt and Road Initiative. But now, on our first argument, that opposite growth. Judges, imagine having a family member die because the because the hospital that was supposed to help him ran out of energy. Imagine not having the possibilities of giving money to your family because the commercial buildings do not have any energy. That was the reality Malaysia, Egypt, Bangladesh, and Pakistan were passing through until China started imposing or helping with general nuclear power corporations and power plants. What we see is that the Belt and Road Initiative provides with infrastructure that allows for more trade, development, and the modernization of telecommunication systems, roads, ports, and railways, which helps ultimately to countries to develop their industries and to plug into international trade. For example, the fact that Australia will eventually import $2 trillion to these nations because they know that they can now invest on these countries. Without this, countries could only have national and local markets instead of international ones. The thing is, now these international markets are much more accessible, which can lead to economies of scale, high production, and lower costs that can improve the products, create new jobs, and increase trade. China has invested $14 billion in Kenya's Standard Gauge Railway. In the end, we tell you, it is not governments that we're talking about. It is people in Kenya that will now have the possibilities of taking their product from one place to another. We also tell you that the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Silk Road Fund are multilateral organizations with several countries like the United Kingdom and Japan. This is where we clash with how they understand the Belt and Road. They want to characterize it as if it is only China. No, judges. It is many countries that are allowing for checks and balances on China to happen. For example, because we have countries like Japan and the United Kingdom, you now have higher standards of transparency, and you are not depending on only one economy as they want to tell you that's a problem. According to the Asian Development Bank, developing Asia will need to invest $26 trillion by 2030. And if the region is to maintain the current growth momentum, it can fight poverty and climate change. That is how we help the environment. Because such a large quantity will need several sources of investment, and the Belt and Road Initiative provides a large and constant source of investment. On the comparative, for most countries there is no alternative, as nobody was investing on them to the extent that the Belt and Road Initiative is. According to the BBC, in recent years, China has loaned more to developing countries than did the World Bank. They want to tell you they have to give no alternative. That is a side that they support. Even when there is investment, the Belt and Road is the only one that is sufficient in the short term. In the end, we tell you that the Belt and Road Initiative provides nations with the necessary tools to increase the economic well-being of the people within these countries, improving the quality of life. It is an alternative for those that have been systematically neglected by other institutions. Our second argument, global balance, where we say that the Belt and Road Initiative reduces unipolarity by balancing the global spheres of influence in the international arena. The West and Russia tend to dominate certain regions, and the power that these nations hold make these nations liable to instability and damages. The Belt and Road is a way in which these hegemons are challenged and provides options to countries. This is very good for several reasons. The first we will give you is that now international institutions tend, for example, to be coerced by dominant nations, mostly the United States. But now with the Belt and Road, we reduce the US sphere of influence, and for example, it is less likely for them to have very bad and unfair decisions on trade. We also see how it is harder for hegemons to act as it wishes in the global arena. Also, other countries have restrictions that can damage developing nations. This is crucial, judges, because the alternative that they don't want to present is, for example, loans and foreign direct investment from the IMF and the World Bank that forces nations to adopt strong measures, as happened after the 2000 economic crisis, where, for example, in countries like Greece, there were IMF impositions in which there were measures of austerity for these countries. If Greece wouldn't have taken this, it would have been way easier for their economies to develop. These two institutions are often the only alternative that these developing countries have. But even in our worst case scenario, while the Belt and Road Initiative is a bad thing, we are incentivizing for more eyes to be set in the region. For example, the fact that there has been a formation known as a Quad, short for the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, made by the United States, Japan, India, and Australia. Also, investment in the Southeast Asia region has been incentivized for Japan to make a $110 billion project. Even in our worst case, we are allowing for these regions to be set to the public eye of the world. What we allow is for them not to be continued to be neglected. They won't want to present you an option. That is the same thing that has been happening for decades. We allow them to grow, we allow them to be better. We are so proud.
That its opposition was accusing us of not making comparatives within this debate, when their entire case is incredibly uncomparative and defensive. When to literally any kind of harm we point out, they say, well, at least there's some infrastructure, at least you have something, and at least that's better than nothing. But what we're running for as proposition is that these things are so bad that it's better to not have them, that they cause an overwhelming amount of harm on the comparative, but we're also showing to you that the little benefits that they do think that they have, even those don't exist to the same extent. So understand that at proposition we're tackling them on both fronts. But apart from that, you need to understand their characterization of them. They've agreed that they give, and we agree to this, right? That China gives loans to countries who for example, the IMF doesn't give loans to. And they agree that they're really desperate. So we have no idea why these desperate countries will tell China, you're giving me $2 billion, let me tell you what policy regulations we're going to put on this money, let me tell you how exactly we're going to spend your money, and let me impose ideas on you. That's not how negotiations work, especially when China has the upper hand, because China doesn't need to give them money, it's those states which really need it. And that's where we think that China is exploiting them. Because the reason that the West and the IMF doesn't give loans to these countries is because it understands that these loans actually harm these countries. Because the IMF actually does threat assessments and it actually does economic analysis, unlike the Asian Investment Bank that China has. Because, no thank you, because it actually cares about those countries. So that's why those international institutions don't give them loans, because they understand they can't repay them. So that's the characterization that we don't think they understand. But simply saying, well, you guys only needed about one country and there are 42 other countries is also really unfair. We're not making this debate completely about Pakistan, and we give you examples about how Laos has a really low GDP, almost equal to that of the loan it's getting, about how Sri Lanka had to give up its port in a 99-year lease. That's an incredibly diverse set of examples that we don't think they're really refuting. But apart from that, let's move on to the issues. Number one, is there any economic benefit for these countries? Sure. And number two, even if there is some sort of economic benefit, and this is us taking them at their best, do the economic and political harms outweigh them on the comparative? Yes, sir.
For the first time in 7 years, China has decreased their military spending. This because they can exert their influence through the economy. Why is this bad?
Sir, we feel like they're actually making military bases all across the world. They're using economy to actually infiltrate into the military. We don't really see where you're getting with that. But firstly, let's move on to the idea of is there any economic benefit for these countries? They don't engage at all with the idea of political bribes and about how most of these regimes are, for example, autocratic or sham democracies. So, for example, how the president Mahinda in Sri Lanka actually made the airport in his own locality, not where it actually helped people, but where it helped only a few amount of people. And we showed you on the comparative that the $8 billion debt that incurred was bad for all Sri Lankans, not just a few, but here we're just trying to establish that the benefit was incredibly limited. But apart from that, their own benefits regarding how it increases trade and how it boosts railways, we think that those things are incredibly marginal at best, and secondly, they take many years to build, and thirdly, even the Kenyan railway isn't fully operational right now. It has a lot of inefficiencies and it keeps breaking down. But apart from that, now that we've shown to you that the economic benefit is incredibly limited, let's move on to the second idea, that even if there is, what are the economic, political and environmental harms? When it comes to the economic harms, we think debt is a huge problem. Their one response to debt was, well, China sometimes pardoned debts. Never do they give one example of this ever happening. But secondly, we don't think that's sustainable to say that, well, China will just go around pardoning debts. If it was going to do that, why didn't it give grants like the USA did in the Marshall Plan if it doesn't expect people to pay them back? That's not good enough to rely on to pray that this benevolent leader will forgive our debts. We're not going to wait on that. We're not going to wait for that risk to take place. But apart from that, this transparency process doesn't really work either. Their best response is the United Kingdom, which is a huge part of the One Belt, One Road initiative apparently, fact to something we didn't know about, but we don't think that it even is, right? We don't think you can expect countries like UK to put transparency measures because those aren't the vulnerable stakeholders we're talking about. When it comes to politics, they think that it's going to create a multipolar world. But let's deal with their characterization, right? Which is the truth, that the USA is retreating and a lot of the West is implementing protectionist policies. So in light of all of this happening, we don't think this really creates an incentive for them because it's not really a unipolar world to begin with, right? You still have China and USA, but we don't think that USA will suddenly enter the fold because it's already retreating. We don't think that you're going to be able to bargain to get the best possible deal within your world. But lastly, when it comes to this idea of environmental benefits, they say, well, these countries will be bound to respect international law. Why should they when China itself doesn't? But on a second level, we showed to you multiple examples about how there is actually no environmental assessment when these loans are given out. But more than that, we showed to you how marine life was threatened, how people were evicted from their homes in the thousands when the Three Gorges Dam was built in Bangladesh. So all of those environmental harms prove to the contrary. Yes, sir.
I literally told you 2 minutes ago that because of the Belt and Road Initiative, they started having a summit with the United Nations. Otherwise, China would not be interested in the environment. Why is that good on your side?
Firstly, you couldn't have told me that literally 2 minutes ago. I was still speaking then. But on a second level, we think that the United Nations doesn't necessarily approve of the One Belt, One Road initiative, and it's actually the China that gets to dictate its terms. We don't know where you heard that. Let's talk to you about the harms to China, a stakeholder that they're not talking about at all within this debate. We feel like there's a financial risk because we can see that although there may be some political benefits in terms of, for example, seizing ports when repayment can be made, there's an active harm. So, for example, the US might increase its funding to its military, but in doing so, its budget reduces in other parts. We think the same kind of harm might happen to China in this case. In two ways. Number one, well, they don't get money back because of the debt trap. But secondly, we think there's a lot of inefficiency at the local level through which the One Belt is passing. So, for example, in the western provinces of China, which are landlocked, local councils are actually relatively underdeveloped and inexperienced because those areas don't get that many resources. That's led to construction delays 6 times within the last year. No, thank you, sir. And that leads to lesser returns overall. We think that's when banks have lesser financial reserves, and that's when they're more likely to fail. We think that's problematic because your international stock market is heavily dependent on China, which is the largest economy in the world. That's when we feel like banks can do, no thank you sir, banks can lose the money of many individuals who depend on them, your regular citizens, people like me and you. We think that's really unfair for those people. That we're repeating the faults of the 2008 crash when banks lent too much money to people, except this time it's just to countries who can't repay them. But on a second level, we think Chinese minorities are persecuted. And we've already showed you that you're empowering autocratic regimes and how they're going to persecute more minorities in other developing countries, right? That's something they haven't haven't refuted yet, by the way, they need to come on those grounds. But now let's also show how minorities within China are hurt. Because when you have the Uyghur minority within the Xinjiang province in the west of China, which are basically a Muslim minority, they're constantly persecuted. They're not allowed to follow the religion. They're thrown into re-education camps and they're forced to eat pork. They're not allowed to pray. Their names are changed. Their identity is stripped of them. And the ones which manage to run away to Kazakhstan have some sort of freedom. But in their world, what's happened basically is that China has actually took those refugees back from Kazakhstan in exchange of giving Kazakhstan some loans. We think that's really unfair for these individuals. Because we're the side that's more comparative, and because we think that there might be one belt, there might be one road, but there are way too many problems, and we don't think we stand for this.
Perilous trade. You will always find bumps, ups, and highs. But at the end of our path, what is true and the end of this road is that we fulfill some of the most basic needs, we reach connectivity, and have the necessary development. I'll do three things in this speech. One, I'll be bringing up the arguments from the proposition. Two, I'll be straightening our own case, and go to a third argument about the role of regional unity. So let's begin with rebuttal. On the first argument, they bring all this potential problems that we'll get by the Belt and Road Initiative. I think, first of all, we have to understand many of the problems they even put on are probabilistic. Those are things like why those countries will go into huge debt. Honestly, the one country that had to default debt was Sri Lanka, out of possibly 60 countries. We think, honestly, at this point, we shouldn't regret that many damages they try to put on have incurred. Thing is, I could go and tell you why all these small images that they try to portray are not so the case. We could tell you, for example, that on the environment, I mean, first off already tells you how like the summit came on, what China is investing right now in real technology, or even how China is working with African nations to take away illegal ivory trade. Or even when we talk about the jobs to Chinese, we could say right now because the wages of the Chinese have increased, more people are on the local countries are receiving the jobs. Or even when we talk about the corrupt leaders, we could say, look, corrupt leaders will always exist on your side. So unless you're against any kind of foreign direct investment, the thing is, the problems that you're putting on will always occur on your side. No thanks. But let's make the comparative here. I think that is the most important thing. We would say that, first of all, we have to understand what are the motives of China. And we honestly ask you judges to think, no thanks, whether China really benefits from taking one foot away or having more regional connectivity and having better partners. We think it is the second. You see, at the moment that we find that China is an economy, as I say, that is isolated. I mean, that was the first thing they started their argument. We think that the way they benefit is by having strong trading partners, countries with which they have strong relationships. No, thank you. And at that point, China cares about these countries. They care about them being well so they can buy their products. They care about them being well so they can be strong partners. You see, that is the real Chinese incentive. But the second thing that we would say is that infrastructure is always better. And that is because not only, no thanks, these decisions are not only being made by one leader on these countries, rather you have a whole political sphere that is coming together as Congress and they're approving things like this kind of infrastructure projects or increasing the debt. But more importantly here, what we say is that even though we're always going to have this kind of collateral damages, the proposition tries to point out, no thanks, this infrastructure always helps the ordinary citizen. That is a citizen that either gets more electricity with more power plants. That is a citizen that is able to grow their businesses and by being able to connect to international trade networks. That is an ordinary citizen that wants more development and is getting it from here. You see, we asked the alternative, and that is because either the proposition, no thanks, wants to keep these countries without getting this infrastructure, or they're agreeing to possibly many other options that will be as harmful as the points they're bringing. You see, development is where it is able to take away these countries from the horrific poverty trap that they've been in for so long.
Sir.
Sure.
Corrupt leaders may exist in our world, but they're funded and empowered by another democratic power in yours. Which world sounds safer to you?
Thing is, this sort of question, what are you promoting? I mean, because if you have corrupt leaders, whatever kind of foreign direct investment the proposition is getting, they're going to get those damages. On our side, we think that it's far better that even if some money is staying for the corrupt leaders, and even for not the most efficient projects, even if it's not the best, there's still going to be benefits coming to the ordinary citizen. That is how we benefit the people. But when we talk about this hegemonic power, I think first of all we bring up, like, China's really not forcing anyone as to doing what they ought to do. I mean, but I think probably some kind of relations come in, and there may be some kind of hegemonic power. But there's no point in which they're forcing people in countries and telling them you ought to do this. But the second thing, and this was the whole point that we bring about checks and balances. You see, for most of these countries, China's already their biggest trading partner. And I think at that point there's already this kind of hegemonic power. Difference is that in our side, we have regional institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That is how we get more checks and balances. And even in the UK, it's not going to be as involved. At least the fact that we have it as a partner makes it to have more of this kind of more of this checks. But more importantly, we think that we're creating parallel institutions. That means the countries now get a choice of whether allying with other hegemons, so that might be Russia or the West or with China. Ultimately, we think that giving more options to countries is far better. But last thing, and the argument that they bring here, the third argument they bring, and that was about the dependency to China and like the minority groups. Honestly, at the point that we look at this region and see that China is already the biggest trading partner for many of those countries, we don't see that is going to be any kind of difference on their side. Unless today the proposition wants to argue that those countries should lose their biggest trading partner that has continuously helped those countries to have both exports and imports, I think the proposition cannot prove those benefits. But let's go back to our own case. On the first argument, I think the proposition is really dropping many of the huge benefits, no thanks, that we bring them first off, and how this is helping the ordinary people to foster their businesses, have basic needs that they get with this kind of development. Honestly, we think those are huge benefits that we get for the people. But in the second argument, and this is where we're talking about, I guess, the structural analysis. The one thing that they answer is that countries cannot make this kind of accurate economic analysis, and thus the IMF choosing what is better is best. We think this is entirely patronizing. We don't think that the IMF has always been the best agent of action in our world. Many times they really hurt a lot many countries. You see, austerity measures are not always the best kind of measures for a country to grow. And we think that at the point that the countries are able to make these decisions with their entire political sphere, that is because they realize that different world models are better, and that is what can help more the people. Because sometimes having more infrastructure and more development is what will make your country be bigger and one day be able to pay that debt without any kind of issue. But the second thing that they say is that, well, countries like the rest of the world won't enter into this region. I think they're really minimizing the argument that we bring here. And that is that we're encouraging other agents on this region to be more active. That goes from countries like India to the US, or even Japan that just announced 110 billion more investment on this region to counteract the Chinese influence. You see, this is not only about China, this is about multilateral action, and even more importantly, about encouraging many other countries to be involved in this region. Lastly, our third argument, and that is the road to regional unity. Judges, in principle, would think that if a country has more financial power, they should invest in the region's infrastructure, because that leads to the promotion of unity and integration. How is this so? When we look at the border of Afghanistan and Iran, we see that people clashed over lacking water. Today, a dam is being built, and you see that some communities that previously had tensions over themselves are now solving this because now they get this infrastructure. But moreover, Belt and Road is promoting human connectivity. That means that we get roads, trains, highways that make it cheaper and easier for people to communicate, visit other nations, and simply connect with the rest of the world. Ultimately, this lets people know their country's culture and, more importantly, people. And this allows for the average people to understand, trust, and have less prejudices against other nations, ultimately allowing for more relations and cross-border enterprises. More importantly, this allows for people to develop a regional identity, being more willing to cooperate and help each other. Even more, the Belt and Road is directly promoting this kind of programs. For example, with the 10,000 scholarships that are given to students from Belt and Road countries to go and study in China. We think this is similar even to Europe, where kind of similar structures were used to connect people. You see, the Belt and Road is connecting a region that used to be isolated and divided. Today they're coming together. And beyond this individual level, even on a global scale, with countries that have better relationships, simply because as they are more culturally close, they become less hostile to each other. Judges, both for a side that is no longer willing to neglect nations, leaving them on the shadow of underdevelopment and isolation.
Roads, ports, and railways. So it's okay if we take over your land. It's okay if we push local people out of their jobs. It's okay if we push you out of your homes so we can build completely unnecessary infrastructure projects because you're getting roads, ports, and railways. Does this analysis, does this justification seem even vaguely familiar to any of you? Because we've heard it all before. We heard it when the East India Company literally took over the Indian subcontinent and ravaged it under the guise of helping us out. We think this is literally just a different conception of the white man's burden, and that is something that we are not okay with. We are not going to let another country colonize the world one more time, and that's why we think opposition deserves to lose this debate, because they simply refuse to engage with a harm as big as that. Don't let history repeat itself. That's what we're talking about, right? But secondly, let's talk about the ordinary man, right? Because this is what the ordinary man has to go through. The ordinary fisherman, which makes up 80% of Gwadar's population, is now going to be out of a job because Chinese MNCs are taking over that job. Secondly, we think, you know what happens to the ordinary man in Ghana? Their taxes are raised because now they have to be bled dry in order to pay back the unsustainable debt that China pushed onto Ghana. What happens to the ordinary man in Sri Lanka? They have to leave their homes because China decided that they wanted to build a completely useless airport in the middle of nowhere, ladies and gentlemen. That's what happens to the ordinary man. What are you doing for them? But let's talk. Sit down, all of you. I'm still talking, right? Over here, let's get a few things out of the way before we move on to the issues, right? First of all, environmental harms. And this is where they're absolutely been lying to us, where they're talking about how China's going green and you know what, they're helping the entire world. Because what's actually happening is that China is going green inside China. What does that mean? That means that corporations in China that used to use outdated technology now need to find a place elsewhere, and that is literally what the Chinese government is doing for them. They're creating a place elsewhere for them in these other countries where they can use outdated methods and damage their environment instead, ladies and gentlemen. And because these countries are sham democracies, they won't cry about it or raise noise about it, so there's no attention on this issue, right? But the next idea over here about their second speaker case, about regional stability within these countries and the spreading of culture. That's really not what's happening on the ground. Because you know what's happening in the province of Balochistan, where Gwadar is located, ladies and gentlemen, in Pakistan. What's happening is that now the citizens of Balochistan are practically on the verge of rebelling against the government, rebelling against CPEC, ladies and gentlemen, because it is literally destroying their land. It is taking over their jobs, it is destroying their culture and creating Chinese enclaves over there. That is not a spread of culture, that is not stability. We don't know what they're talking about. But let's move on to the two issues in this debate, right? First of all, are the BRI's economic benefits a reality or simply a neatly packaged illusion? We think it's definitely the latter. And secondly, where do you have more political benefits on both a regional and international level? Let's talk about the first issue first, right? Over here, opposition had a couple of premises. First of all, they said, oh, you don't have any alternatives, so this is better than nothing. We have a bunch of responses to this. Firstly, we think that they're completely lying about not having any alternatives in the first place. Sri Lanka and Pakistan, both the flagship projects of the BRI, both get help from the IMF, both get aid from the West, from Europe, ladies and gentlemen. So this is a lie. But secondly, you know what? Let's take them at their best. We concede that there aren't any alternatives, right? If there aren't any alternatives, then by their own logic, the decision to accept China's loans was a coerced decision, ladies and gentlemen, which means that these countries had absolutely no leverage and no negotiating power when China pushed these loans onto them. So they're right, this is a dictatorship of no alternatives, and the dictator over here is China, ladies and gentlemen. But the third response, right, they're assuming in this idea of no alternatives is that the only alternative that you can possibly have is external help from outside the country. We think that itself is a lie. We think China itself is an example of how this is not true. They were protectionists for the longest time, passed policies to protect infant industries, and that's how they became a superpower that was then able to open their borders. India is an example for this. They were protectionists for the longest time and are now one of the second or third biggest economy in the world, ladies and gentlemen. You don't need external sources. That's what we've been talking about. But the last assumption this argument makes is that China is even a viable alternative, which ignores all of the harms that Zoha and Saib have been literally listing to you, but they have been ignoring time and time again. But the second premise they had over here, that there will definitely be economic benefits because China has a profit incentive over here. And that shows exactly how naive team opposition is, because they don't understand China's motives. China's motives are not to get profit out of these projects. China's motives is to make sure these projects fail so that they can get land out of these projects instead. And this is a key part of the contracts that they keep missing out. The fact that if you default on your debt, or your debt is forgiven, air quotes, ladies and gentlemen, because the condition to all of this is that you will give up your land, which is exactly what happened in Sri Lanka, where a port is now literally owned by China. It is no longer Sri Lankan property. So even if we say that there's no alternatives, we think that in our world the comparative is that you still have your land, which means that sometime in the future there is still a potential for development. But if China takes over, then not going to go to you because it's not your land any longer, right? But the third idea, that China pardons your debt. First of all, in this idea, they clearly concede that this debt is not payable, right? You cannot repay it successfully, which is why it has to be pardoned. When they say this, they now have the burden to prove to us that China in all cases is necessarily benevolent enough to pardon every single country's debt, which is an absolute lie. But thirdly, we don't think this is actual pardoning, you have to give up your land for it. But the last idea over here, that makes these countries get more access to markets, etc., and that benefits them. Now over here, they're assuming this interdependency will happen because they're assuming it works like the EU. This is not an economic union, ladies and gentlemen. Their relationship, as all the 60 countries' relationship, is not with each other. It is with China. So the only country they have to trade with is China, not each other, so it's not going to happen, sure.
China pardoned 33 countries' debt, including Angola and Djibouti. How is that this is not happening on our side?
Yes. In Djibouti, the condition was, give us a military base on your land. That's not a good enough condition. The US that you stand against, because you say that you need to check on them. Why you do that? Because they did exactly the same thing. Now China is following in the exact same path. Why are you okay with that? So the comparative in this debate is not something versus nothing. It is China pumping loans into you until you could never ever have a potential to have anything in the future, ladies and gentlemen, because everything is now China's. Right, let's move on to the second issue over here. The idea of multipolarity. We think first of all they're assuming that multipolarity can only happen if you have the BRI. We think that's a false assumption. We think multipolarity actually existed before the BRI. We think it existed because over there was a level playing field. But now that 60 countries in the world, 60% of the world's population dances to China's tune, it means that China has overwhelming power over other Czechs like Russia. That's not multipolarity because it's not level playing field. The second idea over here about authoritarian regimes which is simply did not refute. We think that it gets much, much worse in their world because now when they build infrastructure projects, the people think, oh, you might be benefiting us, so they don't stand up against these authoritarian regimes. You legitimize them. That's the issue they haven't dealt with. One belt, one road, way too many problems. Vote Pakistan.
Proposition. What China wants to do is give billions of dollars to developing nations, to crumble their economy, and for them to never be able to complete any type of infrastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, this kind of mentality is completely irrational. At the end of the day, China doesn't benefit by having other nations crumbling, but by having other nations thriving, by having them buy the goods that they present. Two questions to crystallize this debate. First of all, how beneficial is the Belt and Road for the economy and the citizens? And secondly, how beneficial is the Belt and Road for the stability and influence in the world? But before we go into points of clash, let us highlight how the biggest mistakes that the side of proposition claims already exist in the status quo. The only difference is that they do not understand how bigger infrastructure and bigger connectivity would actually be reducing all the damages that they bring that are non-existent, non-exclusive to their side. Now, how beneficial is the Belt and Road for the economy and their citizens? Now, the side of the proposition had a very clear stance. They told us no one is truly benefiting from these. The workers have absolutely no gains. Even if we were to concede that some or even the majority of the work was going to these Chinese workers, we tell you, A, some people from certain nations would still get jobs that wouldn't exist in the first place, or secondly, we actually tell you that Chinese workers, because the middle class in China is actually increasing, the amount that they have to be paid is also increasing. So they're actually starting to hire even more of these local workers. Secondly, they tell us, well, you know what? Many of these poor countries, they are coerced. They have no other alternative. Look, ladies and gentlemen, in the opposition, we have a clear stance. We tell you, nations can make rational decisions. Governments can actually decide what they think is best. If all of this detriment that they're claiming were actually to be true, we think it's very easy for nations to simply say, you know what, we choose not to participate. We think that the paternalistic stance they're taking in this debate is very problematic. They're telling us, oh, you know what, nations such as Kazakhstan or Kenya can't really decide for themselves. That is not the side that we stand on the opposition. We think that at the end of the day, they can actually make coherent and rational decisions. Now, the problem that the side of the proposition thinks about debt, they think that debt is a very, very bad thing. We tell you that no, actually debt is a sign of a healthy economy. If we take a look at some of the most developed nations in the world, such as Japan or Singapore, the way as to why they developed is because they created massive infrastructure projects with the use of getting debt. Because when you get debt, that means that you can actually invest in more things. That is why the healthier economies in our world today have also the highest debts. We do not think that this is necessarily a sign of something bad. And further on with this whole idea of the IMF and the World Bank, ladies and gentlemen, we do not think that even if they stand up here, we do not think that these institutions always care. We do not think they're always right. We tell you that even if this was the case, it's still beneficial because under the side of the opposition, we're giving them an alternative. And let's take them at their best. Let's imagine that the ultimate goal for China is to give billions of dollars for them to default and for them to take the loans, right? Their best example so far has been that of Sri Lanka. First response, we tell you this is a minority of cases. But even if this wasn't the case, even if this was to happen in every single infrastructure project, it's still something that it's not worth your credit. Because even if the majority of the control of the port is in Chinese hands, your average person is still benefiting. Why? Because the price of goods and services become cheaper. Why? Because the cost of transportation is reduced. When you build a highway, it doesn't matter if it's in the hands of the Chinese person, because your average person from Sri Lanka can actually go from one place to another. The fishermen that they claim to care about can actually sell their fishes in nearby towns that they won't be able to transport in the same way. You're reducing costs, you're allowing people to transport, and that is a net benefit that is very important when we have infrastructure. No, thank you. Now, in this world about the environment, even if we were to concede that China does not care, and we actually think that China has constantly proven that they're the country that are investing the most in green technology, we tell you it's still legitimate for some nations to choose to develop in a way that is not necessarily eco-friendly. We tell you that it is good for a nation sometimes to choose, you know what, it's okay to have certain environmental damages if that means that we're lifting millions of people out of poverty. No thanks. Now, at the end of the day, what is the Chinese incentive that they claim is very problematic? We tell you, China doesn't really want these nations to come. What is it that China truly wants? They want to create this infrastructure scheme which allows trade to happen in a more efficient and easier way. Why? Because if this actually happens, these nations will start to buy Chinese goods. Why is this important? Because in order for these nations to be able to buy all these goods, it means that the economy, that the purchasing power of the average person has to be high. If that doesn't work, then the whole scheme falls down. No, thank you. We think it's very naive to simply say that China will benefit by having empty highways, empty ports, and empty energy plants. Now, so how beneficial is the Belt and Road for the economy and its citizens? The truth is that all of the trade problems that they claim, we also have on their side. But these infrastructure schemes are making trade more efficient and allowing it to get to the average person in all of these nations. Let's go to the second point, that of how beneficial is this for global stability and influence. But before I go into that, I'll take you.
The same individual family that now has a road at the same time has to pay higher taxes, has money funneled out of their public healthcare and education system because they can't deal with the debt. Prove to us how your world is any better on the comparative.
I think I understand your point, but you see, we think that bad governmental decisions are not necessarily exclusive to the Belt and Road. We think that the only problem is that those decisions can still happen under your side of the house, but under your side, you do not have the Belt and Road. Under our side, at least we have the guarantee this infrastructure will be created. But now, how beneficial is it for the world's stability and influence? Now, the side of the proposition they claim, well, we shouldn't do this because China does not follow international law because they have a very, very military sense of nationalism. What we tell you is that all of those things existed long before the Belt and Road. We do that the conflict in the South China Sea was there before the Belt and Road. But why is it that this is very important and we should not agree to the Belt and Road? Because China is attempting to spread the sphere of influence not through military means as they have done in the past, but they're actually changing this mind shift and attempting to do so through economic means. On the side of the opposition, we tell you that in principle itself, in attempting to change the way in which the world thinks and in which a nation spreads influence, that is a net benefit that we only have with the Belt and Road. But most importantly, the fact that they tell us, well, there are some corrupt officials. Look, even if the Belt and Road wasn't there, trade would still happen. These officials would still be in power. But what is the difference? You're at least making it easier for these nations to actually receive those goods and for the citizens living there to actually get them. And we'd like to ask the side of the proposition.
Should we just allow these countries that have authoritarian governments to starve? Should we just refuse to trade with them and allow the people that get those goods to actually die? On the side of the opposition, we do not think that that is the right way. But most importantly, what is it that we talked to you in our second argument that we do not think was clearly addressed? We tell you, it's good to challenge hegemonies. It's good that China is now becoming a global force. Why? Because as we explained in the argument of the Quad, other nations have now an incentive to provide better infrastructure deals and better loans. Why? Because when we take a look at nations such as India, the US, or Australia, we think that they are uneasy with China having so much influence. They want to reduce that sphere of influence. What is it that they do? They offer better deals, something that they didn't do in the past. So even if all of the benefits and all of the detriments that they claim is true, we still have a net and very important benefit because you're incentivizing for more trade with bigger nations. Judges, the road to success is always being built. Do not stand with those that regret it. Let's go forward to the future, more equality and more prosperity.
One, what happens with the economy of the region? And two, what about China's headwind? So let's talk about the economy. Proposition make an entire case about the collateral damages that those countries will face. I think on opposition, we give sufficient answers as to why this is not such a big problem. For example, when they talk about work not going to Chinese, not locals, we explain why the salaries for the Chinese people are changing, how there's an increasing middle class, and now, even if not in the past, now more work is going to local people. On the environment, we tell you, look, maybe China was doing bad in the past, but right now it is changing. Honestly, we don't think the proposition can explain this. Why is China exclusively so bad, but why is it so different to other countries that are doing this foreign direct investment? Then they built their argument about why debt is so terrible. And I think on the opposition, we told you, look, you have to compare this with the other options to that. I think the proposition was unable to answer to us. Why, for example, forcing countries to exclusively have the option to get debt from institutions that have this kind of neoliberal way of thinking, like the IMF, is the best way model for these countries to improve in every single case. We honestly think that creating these parallel institutions is always better because countries get a choice as to what kind of model works best for them. Honestly, here's where we also make the point about countries can make their own decisions. I mean, this is not only about one leader in one country choosing we're going to be engaging with China. It's about a whole political process where the Congress is involved, where people are involved, and even as they tell you, if this is not working, people rebel because there are checks and balances with even these countries, and the people are choosing to get this infrastructure in exchange of debt because they know that is the best way for their country to grow. The one example they gave was about Sri Lanka. Honestly, that is the one country that has defaulted out of the entire members. But they would even explain you why this was better for Sri Lanka. They not only were the ones that had to pay for their support, but now they get it on the long run. They're getting 30% of the profits, and more importantly, because that infrastructure is now there in their country, they're getting more economic activity. That means people can get more goods. That means they can expand their businesses. And you see, that is the analysis that we bring as to why infrastructure matters. It matters for the ordinary citizen. They can get more imports, more exports, more goods, basic needs, and it can be included on a network of trade, and ultimately hurt their own business and individuals. Even when we talk about what Chinese really want. You see, within China is really very self-interest. The difference that we say is that there are mutual benefits both for China and the countries on the Belt and Road. We told you why China, I mean, it's really not benefiting by going and corrupting one countries and taking a piece of land. I honestly think that it's far more of an incentive to have a strong partner, which on the long term, as they say, they'll longer be isolated and can trade far more. Countries with which they can expand their trade networks and sell these goods. Probably that is the reason why we told you since first off. How in 2009, 33 countries were forgiven their debt because China cares about these countries. Why? Because that benefits China. But second point of flash, and that was China's hegemon. And here's where they make the whole point about China being bad and not respecting the international order. On the opposition, we told you they're not only not forcing countries as to voting for the same things that they want, but more importantly, they're creating parallel institutions. That means that when you already have other countries, like Russia or the West, that have possibly as bad kind of hegemonic stances as might do China at their best case in the proposition, we think that China, what it's offering is a choice for those countries as to who they want to be allies with. I think here's where we told you that China, more importantly, is a country that is bringing regional unity and integration. This was our whole point of the third argument, and how we're getting more diplomacy, more stability within the region, simply because this allows people to be more connected. Judges, we're talking about a region that has faced division and isolation for far too long. We should not regret one thing that is bringing people together, fostering growth, and making our region something far better off.
The road to success is really bumpy, and that makes it okay. Well, the road to hell is also very bumpy, and we think that what their model is no short of hell when you're empowering autocratic regimes to oppress their people, when you're throwing countries into a pool of debt that they can never recover from, and when you're snatching ports and land away from them, ports which they now can never export from. We think that's problematic. But on another level, we want to point out a contradiction that came in at third opposition. Because when Zoha talked to them, when Zoha asked them that, well, you know, what about, even if the ordinary man gets maybe one road, he's sacrificing a lot of his own income in terms of taxes, he's sacrificing his healthcare, his public education, all of those things. They only reply to that, well, he's doing that in your world too. No, you know why he isn't? Because you said he wasn't in first when you said infrastructure can't be developed without China. So you're admitting that these are unique benefits to China, so these harms also have to be unique. So you can't argue on both grounds. That's why we feel like in their world, they're harming the ordinary man in a very unique way. So constantly saying that, well, you're trading with China in your world too, isn't a refutation if you think about it, because the thing is that we pointed out unique things about the One Belt, One Road initiative, like the debt trap diplomacy thing. In regular trade, you don't go around building ports in other people's countries, you just trade goods with them, right? We told you how these uniquely provide a harm. So even if there's some harm in regular trade, they needed to prove to you it was their burden, then why this extra harm wouldn't exist because of the One Belt, they didn't do that. But firstly, does OBOR infrastructure actually help locals or harm them? Here they said, well, workers aren't replaced, those jobs didn't exist to begin with. We gave you real life context for how those jobs did exist to begin with, for example, fishermen in Gavadir, but now that isn't really the case. They didn't really come onto our grounds and refute this. But at third, they ran this idea and in reply that, well, you have to pay Chinese workers higher because of Chinese laws, which by the way don't apply in other countries. That's why they send them to other countries. It came really late, so we're refuting it now. But apart from that, they dropped the entire stakeholder of the ordinary man in third opposition and in reply, because the ordinary man doesn't have a huge business where he exports and trades goods with other countries where he needs that port. So we really don't think that that ordinary man is benefited within your work. But apart from that, we don't think that that port is even within that person's control. Why do we think so? Because here we talk to you about this idea of debt trap diplomacy and how the ports are taken away. There's singular refutation. Well, debt isn't always bad, it's really healthy. Well, in two countries, yes, well, in Greece it was really bad. So just pointing out where debt was healthy without giving any reasons doesn't stand. But them saying, oh, there's no example apart from Sri Lanka, and then saying 34 countries failed to actually give that debt back and were forgiven is in itself an inconsistency. But on another level, those countries, debt was forgiven in return for land being taken away. That's a premise that they can't comprehend within this debate. It's really sad. But apart from that, on a second level, when it comes to political benefits, we think they don't engage on our premises of polarity, because we told you the US is retreating, no response from them. But apart from that, we told you that the IMF and the World Bank have certain standards which will not be lowered just because of China, because they're not in a hurry or they don't have an incentive to give loans like China. They have no response to that, so there's not going to be a multipolar world. When it comes to empowering autocratic regimes, they don't understand the argument. It's not the fact that they already exist. It's the fact that you're making them even stronger within your world by legitimizing them, and we don't think that's okay. They have to show to you why that's completely fine. But on the level of environment, when they didn't engage with it until reply, where they're like, oh well, it's okay to sometimes sacrifice the environment for a greater economic benefit, which we clearly showed to you doesn't exist, but we proved to you through multiple examples of like Bangladesh, how the environment is harmed within their world. But lastly, they don't cater to the stakeholder of the Chinese people and the Chinese minorities, so they don't cater to the most vulnerable people within this debate, because even though they were being persecuted before, now they have no alternatives. They can't run away to other countries within the region. We think it's highly problematic that their debate is incredibly uncomparative, and because they're simply repackaging colonialism and feeding the same things to individuals under the guise of helping them. We've lived that past before as Pakistan. We shall not live it again.